My name is Elise Crane. I'm the Assistant Public Affairs Officer at the U.S. Embassy in Croatia. And I would have said I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone tuning in from across Europe and the world, because we had several other embassies who had invited audiences to participate, but hopefully we'll be able to share this later. But in any case, we are so glad to have with us tonight Scott Klug, a former US Congressman, who will share his knowledge about the US electoral system and answer your questions. We're thrilled to partner with the Academy for Political Development in Zagreb to bring you this virtual event and celebrate our shared commitment to democratic values. Particular thanks to Ivana Dragicevic for moderating tonight's discussion. Ms. Dragicevic is an alumna of a US government exchange program, and we're so glad to have her as a moderator tonight. So thank you again to you all and for your patience, and I'm going to turn it over now to Velibor Mačkić of the Academy for Political Development. Thank you.
Hello everybody, thank you, Elise. I will just say a few words. We are also thrilled to have this being the first in this fall-winter 2020 session for our cooperation with US Embassy. Academy for Political Development is a public school under the auspices of Council of Europe, and for the last 16 years we've been trying to actively support changes in the society, to debate hot topics, and with these final words, let's talk elections. Thank you.
Thank you, Velibor, and I wish a warm welcome to our dear guest who is now in Wisconsin, Mr. Scott Klug. Good evening and welcome.
Thanks, and thank you, Ivana. Thanks everybody for joining. I thought I'd take a few minutes to start with to tell you a little bit about me and tell you a little bit more about sort of the shape of the U.S. elections at this point, when we're less than, in fact, we're 2 weeks away from today, so it's going to be some interesting times.
I just wanted to introduce you for a second. So basically, you're Director of Public Affairs at Foley Lardner. You're a former congressman. You were a member of US President Bush Advisory Board on Trade, and you're also Emmy Award winning journalist. So very, very interesting and rich biography. As you said, 2 weeks before the elections, you will just give us a frame at the beginning of something everyone probably on this side of Atlantic is always asking about, this US electoral system. Some say these are one of the most important or historic elections, but basically the history of US elections is always, in a sense, dramatic concerning the framework it's being held in. So please give us this, state of play, and then I hope and I encourage everyone to ask questions. Those who are on Zoom call, they can put questions in the group chat, they can put their hands on, and of course, they'll come out with their faces and voices to ask the questions. And of course, everyone on Facebook, whoever is with us also can put and pose their questions there, and we'll try to answer them. We have now a short period of time. So Scott, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks again. Sorry if I jumped on the introduction, I apologize. So I've had a chance to do these several times in the past with the U.S. State Department, and they're always great programs. I think I'm always surprised that our European friends and colleagues seem to know much more about the U.S. electoral system and about the campaigns than an average American does, which is a compliment to you and perhaps a little bit of a critique of my own fellow citizens, who I think just sort of go about their daily life and don't think with the same sort of passion. But let me tell you a little bit, we've got some slides coming up, a little bit about sort of Madison, Wisconsin, and the different areas. So as you heard in the introduction, I'm a former Republican member of Congress. I served in the 1990s. I actually believe that politics was not meant to be a career. I always thought it was meant to be a window of public service. And so I actually am a believer in term limits. I don't think folks should stay in Congress permanently. So I served 8 years and quit. When I left, somebody wrote me a note and said, "Nice job, always leave the stage while they're still applauding." So I think it was a good time to leave my political career. So here's a little bit more about where I'm from. So I represented Madison, Wisconsin in Congress. You can go to the next slide, the Hillary one. So this is what we told people was going to happen 4 years ago when I had a chance to do a similar program in Finland and Sweden. So you can tell how accurate my projections are. So take all of this with a grain of salt. I'm a Republican. I think all of us last year thought the race would be close. I think just about everybody in the world, including Republican circles, was stunned when Trump would win. So at the very end of this, I'll give you my projection for this time out. So on to Wisconsin. Wisconsin is just a little bit bigger than Croatia is. We're in the, if you go to the next slide, please, we're in the center of the heartland. It's always been a battleground state for the last 20 years. For the most part, Democrats have always won it, but it's been razor thin. The Kerry and Bush race was separated by less than about 50,000 votes. The second Obama race was very, very close. So we're just north of Chicago, right on the border of Lake Michigan. I'm actually about 70 miles west from there in Madison, Wisconsin. So Madison's the state capital. It sits on an isthmus, sort of a tiny piece of land in between two lakes. That's the state capital. Madison itself has about 640,000 people in the general metropolitan area. So that's sort of a traditional size. So my background was a little bit different, as you'll see in the next slide. Before I ran for office, I actually had spent time in television and came back to Wisconsin. In sort of a classic American story, I was frustrated by what was going on in Washington. The national debt kept climbing. Government was too big. I'm from sort of the libertarian side of the political spectrum. I think the government works best when it leaves individuals alone and allows individuals to make decisions. I'd rather keep money in the hands of taxpayers than keep it in the hands of government bureaucrats. So I beat a Democrat who was in for 32 years. And I think sort of stunned everybody, including myself, when I won. It was a huge upset and a night where there were lots of upsets. And I stayed in 8 years. So when I got elected, first there was a Republican president and a Democratic Congress. In 92, Bill Clinton was elected. So now we had a Democratic president. And then in 94, after Clinton's first term in office, Republicans took control of the House of Representatives. Are you ready for this? For the first time since 1952. So Democrats had held on it from 1952 all the way to 1994. So I sort of saw all the worlds in charge in the House, a Republican president, a Democratic president. And like I said, after 8 years, I quit. I had 3 boys at home and I figured I missed enough nights. And like I said, I did not think it was meant to be a political career. So on to the election this time. And let's talk about the Electoral College because people are confused. So if you, sorry, back to the slide before that one. So you have to go back to the Constitutional Convention. And there was a huge fight in the Constitutional Convention about how you balance the power of small states with smaller population and how you balance the power of large states. So you had states like New York, even back then, which were dramatically bigger than most other American states were. But how did you then provide power to some of the smaller US states, a place like Delaware? And so the decision at the Constitutional Convention is why we ended up with a 2-house system, a bicameral system. The House is based on population. So my own home state now has 8 members of Congress, but Wisconsin gets 2 senators. And it's sort of that same story throughout. So if you take a look at the electoral, the original 13 colleges, you'll see the, excuse me, the balance between the large states and the small states. And that was really the formation of why the Electoral College got put in place. They didn't want people just to run nationally because their sense was everyone would ignore the small states. And that's the same pattern you see today. So that's really the roots of it. It was a careful balance devised largely by Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. The numbers you see on the screen, for example, in Texas, you'll see that in Texas, for example, because of the size of the state, there are 38 senators and members of Congress. Add those together. In California, on the far west coast, there are 55. If you go to tiny states like Montana, at the very top of the map, or North Dakota, you'll see those are red states. It's 2 senators and only 1 member of the House of Representatives. So when people talk about Electoral College, it's summing up all of those states and their electoral votes to get you over the magic number, which is more than half of the members, half of the delegation, half of 538. So let's talk about where we are today in the current political environment. The one thing I want to stress is that you'll see the Electoral College is never stagnant. So if you'll take a look, this is actually the 2004 race. And if you look, This fundamental pattern to some degree is held steady, that the Democrats dominate the West Coast. The Democrats control the large states in the Northeast. The Midwest is sort of a battleground state. And then the rest of the country in that race was largely red and Trump won. But now if you jump forward 4 years after that, 8 years after this is Obama and Biden. And what changes do you see? Well, you'll see to a large degree, a lot of states in the US Southwest, places like Nevada, Colorado, and New Mexico swung and became Democratic. Obama won Florida with 29 electoral votes, and then he won Michigan and Ohio. And Ohio is interesting because if you look historically, it's very difficult for a Republican president to win the election without carrying Ohio. So let's go to the slide now of where we are and look at battleground states. And if you think about it, it's the same cluster over and over and over. No Republican is going to win California. No Democrat is going to win, Alabama or Kentucky or Mississippi or places like that. The only thing that's different really this time out is a couple of states I'll point to. Ohio now appears to be a battleground state. Last time out, Trump won Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, which was a bit of a surprise. The Democrats think this time that Texas is in play. Texas demographics are changing a lot. A lot of people will say, oh, Texas, there's a huge growth in the Hispanic community. That's part of the story. But the Hispanic community isn't monolithic, right? So Hispanics in Florida, Venezuelan, and Cubans tend to vote Republican. Hispanics in Texas tend to be Democrats. They tend to vote more Democratic. But actually what's happening in Texas and also in Arizona and Nevada is it's out-migration significantly from California. And California tends to be very Democratic, very progressive. And it's a funny thing about this because if you think what makes Texas different is Texas has always had low tax rates, very pro-business. You sort of think of the Texas swagger in big towns. That's very different from cities like Houston and Dallas today, which tend to be much more diverse and not sort of traditionally Texas. So anyway, Texas will be interesting to watch. The Democrats will think it's in play. I think it's in play. I don't think there's any way in the world they win it. So on to the next map, if you would, please. So again, if you look, it's the balance about individual states. So candidates who are Republicans are going to spend a lot more time in Texas because it's got 38 Electoral College votes. If you look at a little state like Maine, it only has 3. But the effect of this again is, if you go back to what the fathers were thinking at in the Constitutional Convention, they really wanted to make sure that presidential candidates paid attention to little states, that it just did not become a battle over Florida and Texas and California and New York. So that's very much ingrained in the system. We can talk about this later. There's a movement afoot to essentially eliminate the Electoral College, which I think is a very tough political fight if somebody wants to do it. But there's a mood in the country to change it, as there's a mood in the country to change lots of longstanding rules to simply gain an advantage. Next slide, if we could. So some election basics, you probably know all this, but it helps just to reflect it. The senators get elected for 6 years. Members of the House get elected every 2 years. Every year, 1/3 of the Senate is up. Every year, everybody in the House is up. So there's 435 House members in the House of Representatives. The interesting thing is every 10 years after there's a census, the state legislatures redraw the maps for congressional districts. So there are lots of fights going on below the presidential level, below the Senate races, below the House races, to see who will control the state assembly and the state Senate in Virginia and Texas and Nevada. Because if you could draw the maps just slightly different, you can tilt the playing field one way or the other. So for example, in Wisconsin, the Republicans have controlled the state assembly and have controlled the state assembly for years. It's now a 6-3 congressional split, but it's largely a 6-3 congressional split because the folks in the state legislature have been able to draw the maps the right way. So this becomes an interesting election, not only because of what's happening in the election itself, but what's going to happen in the state elections afterwards, because voting rules, the size and configuration of congressional districts are actually controlled by the state legislatures. And I think that's something that really confuses my European friends, because much more of it is done on the federal level. We have much more control on the state level. And back to my personal political bias, I'd rather have more things decided at the state, because the state legislators and the state governor are much closer to the people than the president and Congresses, oftentimes who live and buried in Washington. So next slide, please. So one of the interesting things, back to the sort of rules for the election, there's been a lot of controversy about mail-in ballots and what the rules are for counting mail-in ballots and absentee ballots. So mail-in ballots are ballots that people literally send through the mail. Absentee ballots can be that I'll go to the county courthouse and pick up a ballot and actually drop it off while I'm there. So you're voting early, but as it doesn't go through the mail. So if you look at ballots, return as of October 5th, almost 40% of Wisconsin's ballots are already in. If you look at some places like Pennsylvania, it's really low. Here's one thing to watch though as we go forward. According to an analysis just this week, 40% of Biden voters across the country have already voted, only 14% of Trump. So one of the things you have to be careful about looking at these early ballot surges is where they came from. And you have to think about too where the ballots are, right? So if there's a huge surge of votes in New York, it really doesn't matter because Biden's going to win New York. If there's a huge surge of battles in battleground states, it'll be difficult. And there's been lots of court cases because they're expecting such a large surge of ballots just before Thanksgiving, which is a large American holiday, that they're worried people aren't going to have a chance to get enough ballots in the mail that actually hit and are postmarked, that they've been stamped by the post offices received before they can actually be counted. And some states also have different rules about how soon you can start counting absentee and mail-in ballots. So for example, Oregon has had a very sophisticated mail-in system for years. They can actually start counting the Saturday before the election. In Wisconsin, you actually can't open the absentee ballots or the mail-in ballots till the Tuesday of the election. So one of the things people are concerned about is what kind of delays there's going to be on counting these. And if you remember some of the states last time, the margins were very narrow, 25, 35, 40,000 votes. So it could be some states like Pennsylvania, which has had some controversial court rulings, could be late in counting ballots. And if the races are really close, we could actually have 2 or 3, 4 days of election chaos, much like we had in Florida in 2000 when Bush and Gore ran against each other. Next slide. So if you look at this map and sort of think back to what we looked at just a few minutes ago, the battleground states for the Senate look a lot like the battleground states for the presidential election. The map at this point, because there's 33 senators up every 2 years, so 1/3 runs this year, a second third of the senators run 2 years from now, and a third in 2024. The map this year largely favors Democrats because most of the Democrats who are up are very safe Democratic states. Many of the Republicans who are up are in swing states. And so if you look, for example, in the upper right corner, Susan Collins, who's been a senator for years and an independent Republican, is in a very tough fight because of the Supreme Court nomination of Judge Kavanaugh. If you look at North Carolina, sort of midway down the Atlantic coast, it's essentially, the race is almost tied right now. If Trump wins, the Republican senator probably gets reelected. If Trump loses, the Democrats probably pick up a seat. So at this point, the Republicans are up by 4, but the Republicans are going to win the seat in Alabama. So the challenge for Democrats, the Republicans are up by 3. So they'll pick up 1 in Alabama, that's 4. So Democrats have to win 5 total in order to get this. Next slide. I think most objective analysis with this point would say that Democrats are slight favorites to control the Senate. But you see, as you'll see at the presidential level, that the presidential numbers are tightening. And don't look at the presidential numbers nationally because they really don't mean that much. Like I said earlier, you know, Hillary Clinton's going to, flashback to my earlier slides. Clearly, Joe Biden's going to win New York by 65 to 35. So those margins really don't make a difference. It's who wins North Carolina or Maine or Iowa or Wisconsin by 1 or 2 or 3 points. And if you look at the polling this morning, most of those states, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Florida, Arizona, are 1, 2, or 3 point races, which is your political science students, which many of you are. You know that's within the interval where you can have errors, and that's what happened last time on in the Trump election. So the Senate's really seriously in play. Next one, please. Some trends we're talking about: more women get elected in elections, and you're going to see that this time out. So the House and the Senate are beginning to change. More good women candidates than ever before, and that's a fairly dramatic shift in American politics and sort of the culture of it. And I think that trend, frankly, will just keep accelerating. More better women candidates and more women candidates who win. A couple other election trends. So if you look back at 18, you'll see Democrats won more than 250 counties with the most white female university graduates. There's a huge gender gap in the US. Women, for the most part, lean Democratic. Men, for the most part, tend to lean Republican. Now, that's not uniform. It's always interesting because the question's always framed, what will Republicans do to get more women voters? The question is rarely asked, what will Democrats do to get more male voters? So if you'll see this, you'll see the change. And look at this. This is the map of residents living in rural areas. You'll see 580 voted Republican, 61 of the counties voted Democratic. So there's a national trend that big cities tend to vote Democratic. The rural areas tend to vote Republican, back to the Electoral College. And the suburban voters sort of swing back and forth. So 4 years ago, Trump did much better with suburban voters. In the midterm election 2 years ago, the Democrats did much better in the House elections. And actually, I forgot a slide here, but the Democrats are overwhelmingly favored to hold on to the House. And when they hold on to the House, that means that they'll be in great shape to help support President Biden. One more slide. Foreign policy, let's click through these sort of quickly, just keep clicking through. I think you'll see significant difference between Biden and Trump. Trump will keep his unilateral trend. I think Biden has more Obama roots, he'll be more multilateral. I think China will be interesting because I think Biden will be more hawkish than he's been historically. I think he will try to rekindle an Iran deal. And on climate change, I think he'll rejoin the Paris Accords, which Trump left. Last slide. So it was pretty bad last time out. So 4 years, if you look at this, this actually comes from a website called 538 Politics, which takes a look at all the polls. This is one where they actually ran it like 40,000 times. I think that it's going to be very difficult for Trump to win. There hasn't been any momentum, but now 2 weeks out, we're going to see in the next 2, 3, 4 days, I think you'll see those polls get closer and closer. And it's just who shows up on election night. But if you look at what Trump had to win last time in order to win this next time out, he really doesn't have any margin for error. So that's what I think is going to happen. I think Democrats will control the House, and I think the Senate will probably be 51-49 one way or the other, and there's a pretty good chance it may actually be 50-50. So let me end there and go to your questions that you asked or from our moderator.
Thank you so much, Scott. It was a great overview. We see, lots of issues, lots of questions, some old ones, some, of course, new ones concerning the policy matters also. But as we were a little bit late because the Facebook Live didn't start, we already received loads of questions, not just from the members of the Academy of Political Development in Zagreb, but also all those who are watching us, not just in Croatia, but around Europe. So maybe to mix it a little bit up, because that's everyone's question, I will start reading out the question of Tamara Puhovsky from Zagreb. She said she has an obvious question, basically. How do you feel that pandemics will change 3 aspects of the elections? What voters value? Is it health, economy? She calls it isolationism. How they vote, so the turnout, etc. And how, we already mentioned it, but how can we predict results, polls, and predictability in this kind of turbulent times? We know that in 2016, not just you, but loads of people were, I can say wrong now, but it was this Trump factor that happened, and the president is here in the office. But now with the pandemics, with, this, what you've mentioned, early votes, which are much higher, but we need to see where they come from. In any case, how can we answer these questions to Tamara? Thank you.
Sure. So actually, there was just a study done asking Americans what were the top 4 issues. So the top 4 issues, to get it right, were the corona outbreak, the fairness of presidential elections, healthcare, and jobs in the economy. The highest was for pandemic at 60%, and the economy was 52%. So for most members of the American public, those are the 4 issues they're voting on. I think everybody has mixed feelings on the pandemic, and that we looked sort of longingly to Europe for a while, that it seemed as if all of you had done a much better job. But it seems like you're sort of shooting where we are at this point. I don't think there's easy answers for the pandemic. We're not a totalitarian society, so you really can't lock everything down. Actually, my home state of Wisconsin now is one of the worst in the country. So I think the pandemic will be a factor in balancing that. If you look at those 4 issues, I think that Biden probably has an advantage on the virus, has an advantage on, excuse me, fairness in the elections, has an advantage on healthcare. That's always traditionally a Democratic thing. Trump still maintains an advantage on the economy. But I think given the choice, they think Trump will do a better job getting the US economy moving, but not necessarily, you got sort of 3 issues on one side and 1 on the other. So that's sort of that answer. What was your last question, Ivana? The 3 parts?
The last question was basically the predictability. There's another one, loads of questions talking about, you know, predictions and polls that were wrong that time. So how can we be sure, you know, how can polling and this predictive methods basically that are there for normal times, and they failed in normal times 4 years ago, how can we be sure that, you know, these trends that we're already seeing will be like that at the end?
Well, I think pollsters, you know, because I used to have pollsters for my campaigns, do the best job they can. But when you set up a poll, you have to figure out what the turnout's going to be, period. And then you have to weight the turnout, right, for folks who are, you know, older white male farmers and suburban women who teach at schools. You've got to sort of try to mix those together in a way. And it's those factors that I think have been difficult to shift. You know, I know there was a real problem in the UK with the quiet Tory. I mean, they were pretty wrong on the last parliamentary election. They had it wrong on the Scottish election, and they had it wrong, you know, on leaving the European Union. So if I was pollsters, I'd still be nervous, especially when you're trying to weigh, you know, in-person, out-of-person voting, what goes on. I think nationally, there's no doubt in my mind that Biden's up substantially if you do the national popular vote. I think if you do battleground states, again, they're tightening. Like Wisconsin's 2 points, North Carolina's 1, Florida's 2, Nevada's down to 2. So they're all very close to do it. So the answer is, I'm not sure I really have a lot of confidence. If you look at the graphic I showed you about Hillary Clinton winning, that's a group that takes all of the polls and sort of sums them up and then tries to balance them all. So I think the Nate Silver group at 538 does a really good job. They were one of the few last time that actually projected that Trump would be competitive. Now, there's a poll that's called by Investors Business Daily, which last time was the one that did the national survey and got it the closest. And in their poll, Biden's numbers are falling, Trump numbers are coming up. And so they've got it at 48, 46. So they've got the national vote much closer than anybody else does, but they could be completely wrong. So I think polling's tough. And the other thing that's changed back, you know, when I ran a million years ago, is everybody had landlines. Now, most people don't have landlines. It's hard to get cell phone numbers. People vote on the internet. People refuse to answer. So I think a pollster's job just keeps getting harder and harder, and I'm not sure how much more accurate they'll be. And I'll shut up so I can answer more questions.
It's okay. Technology also changed, which also was the issue in the US elections from Obama and Biden campaign to Trump campaign. But concerning a lot of questions about basically policy issues in the election, but one very interesting, just to find it, that comes from Portugal to us, from Sofia. She is asking, what happens if after vote count current president loses but does not concede, because that was one of the issues in the last couple of weeks, and also connected to this doubts about mail-in ballots and stuff. So maybe you can put it all together in an answer.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of Democratic friends. That's their nightmare, that there's going to be some kind of civil strife in the streets and that Trump will refuse to leave the office. And I just don't think it makes for like a good television show. I don't really think it's reality. And as you know, the president is prone to bluster. So I think at the end of the day, if he loses, he'll do it. Now, what happens if it comes down? I mean, who would have thought in 2000 that the Bush-Gore campaign would come down to one state and really, you know, less than 5,000 votes decided the presidential election? Because there's been such a huge shift to mail-in voting, there's actually some logistic stuff that's in question. So if you send a mail-in ballot, you have to sign the outside of the envelope. And then most states require the folks who work there to certify the election. And in order to certify that ballot, in order to certify it, for example, they usually look at people's driver's licenses. I don't know about you, but my signature, I think, rarely looks the same twice because I'm not paying attention. Sometimes when you sign important documents, you're very careful. Half the time, if I sign a receipt at a restaurant, it's sort of two squiggles. So that could be an interesting challenge and a problem because a lot of those could be contested and it could have an impact on the votes. Again, I don't think that's an issue in 40 of the states in the country, but in some of the battleground states, it could be an issue. And frankly, because of the virus, it's happened so quickly, lots of local voting authorities are struggling getting up to speed.
Talking about the issues in the campaign, we have a question from Jana Lusha from the Faculty of Political Science in Zagreb. She wants to know, of course, how big influence on the elections will have Black Lives Matter movement and what she calls racial unrest. And I will broaden maybe this question. We know what this balance is about. You know, Trump talking about law and order and some kind of ideas of reforming policing system from one side, but maybe to talk about this legislative side and some kind of, let's call it cultural or identitarian side of that issue.
Well, I think that those issues are important for young people, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with folks under the age of 30 and how they vote. So I have 3 boys. My oldest is sort of like his dad, more of a traditional libertarian. My other 2 are far to the left and even further to the left. For them, you know, they've been involved in the protest movement. They've been involved in talking to friends. They're very concerned about this. And I think that will be a huge influence in their going to polls to vote in the presidential race. But remember, back to local in the US, I mean, the issues in Minneapolis with the George Floyd case are really the Minneapolis City Council has to act, followed by the Minnesota State Legislature. So I don't think you know, whether they're going to defund the police, put more money in the police, stand up for the police, criticize the police, that's really a local issue. Trump has tried to make this a national law and order issue because of demonstrations in Oregon and, you know, in Wisconsin, in Kenosha, sort of near in between Milwaukee and Chicago, there was a police shooting, lots of protests, small businesses burned down. I don't think it's been as powerful an issue as Trump thought it would be. That's what Richard Nixon did back in the old days in a race against Hubert Humphrey. The last time there was a lot of civil unrest in the US in like '68, it was the Vietnam War. There were lots of protests at universities. At the University of Wisconsin.
Chicago 7 case, we now have a very good movie about that situation.
Yeah, I think it's a very good movie. I don't think it's very factual, but that's another story. But if you look at '68, there were riots at the Chicago Convention. At the University of Wisconsin, there was one of the military recruiting sites was blown up. Sadly, it was in a building where there was cancer research being done, and much of the cancer research was destroyed. So if you look back at '68, I was talking to my kids about this. I mean, the demonstrations, the violence, the anxiety was far more pitched than it is right now. And so I think for Nixon that cut through. I think trying to build a whole presidential campaign about, you know, 300 guys camping in downtown Portland really didn't move people very much. So I think the Black Lives Matter issue will matter to my sort of 30-year-old kids and younger. I'm not sure it's a defining factor in the presidential race. If you go back, as I said, it's the economy and the virus, which are much more important.
Talking about this, let's say, formative things, we have a couple of questions. One from Leon Runje about Electoral College reform. So he asks, what are the chances of the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact being successful in supplanting the Electoral College? And we have also one question, if the polls take into effect the county limit gerrymandering when they extrapolate the 270.
Well, no, I mean, gerrymandering just has to do with where the congressional districts are drawn. So as I said earlier, for example, in Wisconsin, the state legislature has the authority excuse me, to draw the congressional maps. So there's no sort of self-correcting for gerrymandering afterwards, because I don't know how you would unwind that. And in the US political systems, the maps actually have to be down to like plus or minus 5 people. So you can't, there's not a lot of room to move stuff around. You can obviously shift it one way or the other, concentrate Democrats in one area, or move it to make, for example, disadvantage one incumbent, which is happening a lot in Texas. As the Texas population have grown, the maps in Texas have changed a lot, which has put more chaos on the Republican side than you traditionally see. One of the challenges for President Biden, if he gets elected, is how many of these large institutional fights does he want to take on? There's a lot of ideas out there right now. Presidents usually have a window for the first 15 months to get something dramatically done. Bill Clinton tried to do it with healthcare, it never happened. President Obama did it with healthcare, it did happen. Trump did it with tax cuts, that happened. But the idea that you're going to change the Electoral College, pack the Supreme Court, make Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia states, I just don't think you can get all that stuff done. It's too much structural stuff. And the risk for the Democrats, and I've been here on the other side, is they get elected for 2 years. Given the map 2 years from now, the Senate is likely to stay Democratic if they take control. They'll get blown out in the House. Like I said earlier, when I was around, elected in 90, Clinton passed the biggest tax plan in 1992. And in 1994, they lost the House for the first time since 1952. So if Democrats do a lot of this stuff, they'll get killed in the suburbs 2 years from now and lose control. And I think moderate and conservative Democrats understand that. I think those are Biden's instincts, but he's got 100 progressives in Congress who are sort of saying, if not now, when? And I think if they try to do all that stuff, they're just shooting themselves in the head. You can't do all that. The US system's too stable.
Well, on this year's elections, of course, because of the pandemics, economy, and everything that you've mentioned, foreign policy, in a sense, isn't, on top. But as you're talking to the European audience, and I see a lot of questions here, talking about what changes can be made there in the foreign policy, and especially towards NATO and European allies. So we don't have time to analyze, this mandate's foreign policy, which was in a way different. You are also the member of US President Advisory Board on trade. Trade was very important issue in the Trump's mandate. So maybe you can just put this into perspective.
Sure. Just so you know, I'm an Atlanticist. I was a member of the German Marshall Fund board for years. And so I spent lots of times in Europe. I think US-European relationships, along with the UK, are at the center of American foreign policy. But let me also say, I think it's goofy that the Germans have not paid their fair share of NATO and that France doesn't contribute their percentage. And while I disagree with the president on a lot of stuff, I think he's actually, he's been absolutely right. Like most folks in my situation, I've been frustrated with Merkel, who doesn't really seem to want to play very forceful with the Russians. I think the fact they continue to build this gas line just puts them absolutely at the mercy of the Russians. So I'm a strong supporter of NATO. But I think after the US, writing the check for almost 70 years, I really think it's time for the Europeans to spend much more. It's their defense more than it is ours. But so if Biden gets elected, I think we'll go back to a very traditional system where he'll be less critical of our allies. If Trump gets reelected, I think he'll be more forceful on trying to change this dynamic. So while I don't like a lot of what the president did, I'm committed to NATO. But I think the ground rules have to change.
Before I would ask in a minute, Ms. Rachel Kamaras to join us via video because I want to see her. She's a Croatian who moved to the United States. So hi to LA, I think you're there in California.
Hi.
But before you ask the question, I would really like for you to answer me, because we remember how important, social media, changing of the narrative in the election campaign was in 2016. And of course, it started basically with Obama in a way. But how important this will be this year in 2 weeks, because, how to manage the process with the pandemics and when this crazy times over. I'm trying to sum up a couple of questions. So sorry if I'm not that precise. Thank you. And then I'll give the floor to Rashika.
Are you asking me or her? I'm sorry.
I'm asking you about the influence of social
Oh.
media on the elections, and then I'll pass it to her because she has one interesting question as, you know, someone who moved from here there.
Sure. So I think one of the questions that we haven't gotten yet, but I'm sure it'll come, is about how harsh the partisanship is in the U.S. And I think to a large degree, the partisanship is so harsh because there's no breathing room left in the system. So if you go back years ago, my dad was a Republican, but he always used to vote for a Democratic senator in Wisconsin named Bill Proxmire, who I really liked. But once a year, my dad would get really mad and he'd write a letter, you know, longhand to Bill Proxmire, who would handle it to my poor suffering mother, who had to type it up on a manual typewriter, and then give it back to my dad, who would edit it again. And then my mother would retype it, my dad would sign it, and he'd put the envelope on the desk, and my mother would refuse to mail it because she said if it was his letter, he had to put the stamp on it. He had to mail it. Well, then a week later, it shows up in Washington where some poor 24-year-old opens it up, reads it, hands it to the staffer who handles whatever this issue was. In my dad's case, it was probably a business issue, who then has to write a response letter, who then has to give it to the legislative director, who then has to give it to the chief of staff to approve it, where it now goes to an office pool where somebody there is typing it on an electric typewriter because it's much fancier. It gets in the mail, and about 2.5 months later, it shows up at my dad's mailbox. And my dad, when he opens the letter, can't even remember what he's mad about anymore. But if you look in the American political environment today, as soon as somebody's done with the speech, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, not even done with the speech, the first sentence out of their mouth, the social media world blows up. And I don't know how you put this genie back in the bottle, but I think it's a real problem because people just get themselves so wired up. They tend to get reinforced by people who have the same worldview they do. And the middle just keeps shrinking and shrinking. And American politics has always depended on sort of a central consensus, right? There's always been sort of 20% and 20% on the left and the right who are the true believers. And the rest of the people in the middle, about 60%, sort of lean one way or the other, but not entirely total. So the answer is the social media is having a dramatic impact. And unfortunately, from my perspective, it's very effective in engaging people and turning folks out to vote. I don't know that it's very effective engaging people on thoughtful discussions of issues.
Thank you so much. Rashilka, please, you have your question. I just have to remind everyone, pose your questions for next 10 minutes. After Rashilka, we have another video question because we will finish, we were late for 10 minutes, so we will finish at 7 and 10. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So my question, Mr. Klug, is how do you see the American society will act basically, you know, post-elections? Because now here in LA, what I can see and what I've seen road tripping through the other states in past 2 months is that not only the riots, but, you know, fights between Democratic voters and Republican ones. So even my friends and people who live here, Americans, are really afraid of the civil war, which is the, you know, the word that we from Balkans really don't like to hear. So how do you see this will affect society, people, and is this really a realistic scenario? Thank you.
I have 3 boys, 2 of them who live in Los Angeles, and like you, they're actually concerned about sort of civil unrest. I guess I take the long view. I think 68 was a much more turbulent time in US history with Martin Luther King being shot, Bobby Kennedy being shot, more significant racial riots than we've had at this time. Malcolm X was killed. The Vietnam War hung over everything. So my sense, if we manage to get through the Civil War, World War I, World War II, you know, the riots in 68, the collapse of the economy, thanks to Jimmy Carter in the 70s, you know, all the problems we had with the economy in 1991, I guess I'm far more optimistic. Will there be 2 or 3 incidents where stuff happens? Absolutely. But do I think they're going to be, you know, fistfights and machine guns in the Hollywood Bowl? I don't think so. I don't think it's going to happen.
Thank you so much. We have a question from a viewer at American Corner in Rijeka, nice town, European capital of culture still. It's been so long. Can the Republican Party outlive Trump and stay a coherent party?
That's a very good question. And I actually had a chance to do this presentation in Iceland 4 years ago. And that was even a question back then. Yeah, I think the Republican Party is going to have to do some soul searching. If Trump wins, it's sort of dramatically changing things. I think he's sort of our Berlusconi, right? You saw Berlusconi up and close in Italy. I think he's a larger than life character that once he's gone, I don't think he has a lasting impact. I think there's been some reshuffling of where people's votes are, but if you look at rural areas, they've always historically been more conservative, more Republican. The cities have always been largely Democratic. I mean, if you look at all the big US cities from Los Angeles to Chicago to New York, they're all Democratic mayors. So the big cities aren't going to change. The swing is really over the suburbs. And I think they'll, you know, just as there's the potential with a Biden presidency, I think for a big fight between the progressives and the more centrist Democrats. And I think that's going to be a real issue because I think the progressives are going to push hard in the House. I also think there's going to be a real fight in the Republican Party if Trump loses, which direction the Republicans head. And if you look, there's already probably 9 or 10 potential presidential candidates. I don't count Mike Pence among the serious candidates moving forward, especially if Trump loses, which I think he will. So I don't know which way the Republican Party goes, but I think Trump will be a strange blip on the radar. We've had populist candidates in the past. Andrew Jackson was a populist in the 1830s. William Jennings Bryan at the turn of the 20th century was a populist candidate. Trump just happens to be the one who won, I think largely based on his sort of TV media personality. So I think he'll be a strange footnote in American history by the time it's done.
Thank you. We have another video question from Zagreb from Lamia Lechkovic. I think Lamia is here with us on video, please.
Yes, I'm here. Hi, Ivana, and thank you very much for answering the question about outliving Trump and the Republican Party. But what I wonder and what I have to be very transparent and open about is this idea and the feeling that the democracy during this, let's say, Trump period was a bit brought into the question. So I think that I would like to hear the answer on how would United States outlive the Trump era? And of course, are you expecting any interference from the foreign powers out of America who might interfere into these elections, just like in 2016, and to what effect?
Yeah, I think the question about Russian interference is very polarizing in the U.S. I mean, I think at the end of the day, there's a lot of questions about why the FBI bought into this Steele dossier when the FBI itself knew that there wasn't any validity to it. So there's a lot of unsettling. I'm sure there'll be meddling. I would suspect both the Chinese and Russians will be up to games. At the same time, I'm not really sure what was it the Russians spent $300,000 on Facebook ads when the United States is going to spend, you know, $300 or $400 million on this election was really a driving factor. So I think they're going to try to meddle. I would be more worried in the long run if they're able to meddle with U.S. election tabulation. They could somehow get in the machines and change the actual numbers. But since we're going to mail-in ballots, it's much safer. It's not as electronic as it was historically. So I suspect there'll be attempts to meddle. And I think that's a dangerous precedent. I'm just not really sure that I think it's going to be the deciding factor one way or the other.
And the question that she posed you, how will U.S. democracy outlive Trump?
I think the democracy's fine. Your friend in California doesn't see chaos in the streets. I'm sorry?
I'm just repeating it, not to be left unanswered.
What's changed? I mean, the elections are on schedule. There could be questions in some states because of how fast they've had to respond to the COVID crisis to have mail-in ballots. But, you know, the last time I checked, the Madison City Council was working. The governor in Wisconsin's up trying to figure out the COVID ballot. I don't necessarily think you can see Trump as an indication of what's happening in American democracy. And I think, you know, I think push come to shove, I think half of the people who will vote for him will shake his head at him. I mean, I just think he's a strange character.
We have loads of questions, so I think that we have attention. One comes from the member of the Academy. Does Wall Street and corporate elite support more Biden or Trump, and why is the question?
I think there's a split. I think if you look historically at who Wall Street supports, it tends to be more Democrats. You know, and if you look at people, you know, Rahm Emanuel, who was Obama's chief of staff, left Clinton to work for Wall Street and then came back to work for the president. So I think there's much more nexus there. I think the giant social media companies are very heavily Democratic. It's an issue because of some of the issues that have gone on with Facebook and LinkedIn and the other social media stuff and what sort of their internal censor relationships are. And I think the American social media companies are going to have a huge fight the next 4 years, especially if the Republicans retain control in the Senate and the White House. Large corporate companies tend to be more pro-trade, pro-growth, pro-business. The only change I think that's really been interesting is that if you go back and look when I worked for the Bush administration on the advisory committee for trade, most large corporations were very heavily pro-trade, and all of them believed that at some point China would become a good actor in the US, in the world global economic system. I think that even the Biden administration is going to be very hostile to China. So the answer is it sort of splits. As a general rule, I would say the basis of the Republican Party in terms of giving tends to be more small business owners and folks who own manufacturing companies of 100 employees, not folks who employ 10,000. So I think you have to differentiate that. The Republican Party's always been small markets, small towns, small businesses, more of an emphasis on individual self-reliance than on the group. And it's always been interesting to me. One quick observation, I'll sort of speed answer going forward, but it's always been interesting with what American presidents European likes and what American presidents Europeans don't like. And I've always thought Europeans like American presidents who are very Europeanish. Woodrow Wilson, John Kennedy, Bill Clinton, he was a Rhodes Scholar, Barack Obama was learned. They hated Teddy Roosevelt. They didn't like George Bush. They really hated Ronald Reagan. And so there's sort of candidates I would describe as Eastern, you know, it's all folks who went to Yale, Harvard, part of the East Coast elite, versus another school of American politicians who largely identify with the West and a sense of individualism. So that's sort of a dual strain in American politics. And it's, you know, and sure, if we're doing a poll online here, it would be about 85-15 for Biden versus Trump. And in the 1980s, when I was a fellow in Germany and they were putting the Pershing missiles in Germany, I'm sure the vote was 85-15 against Ronald Reagan. So there's sort of a blind spot in Europeans, I think, for that other school of American politicians.
Thank you. We have time for, let's say, 3 more questions. I will try to read. One is coming from Sierra Crosby from the United States. So what are your thoughts on ending the census early and potentially excluding undocumented immigrants from the count? How much would it change the makeup of the House of Representatives? Thank you.
I don't think it really changes the House of Representatives. I think it changes the funding levels that go to big cities where undocumented aliens in many cases tend to be concentrated, much more so than in rural or in suburban areas. So it could affect the funding that would go to big cities in California, large cities in New York. So I don't think it will really change, excuse me, in terms of the census for redistricting. I do think it'll impact cities and states on the funding levels they get from Washington, D.C. And the Supreme Court's already ruled that it can be ended early. So the question's answered.
I've asked you, there was a question about relations about the EU and the NATO, but there's one little bit broader questions coming from Kubra from Turkey. So what are you thinking that basically foreign policy of the US will be if, you know, there's going to be a change in the White House, and what will be the foreign policy if there's going to be the same result as 4 years ago?
Well, so for Biden, as I said earlier, I think they'll be much more collaborative. They're bigger believers in institutions. I think they're bigger believers in trying to build consensus. I think Republicans would say you can belong to the Paris Climate Accords, but if nobody actually hits any of the targets, what's the point? I mean, I think that would be the difference. I think Biden will carry on largely the foreign policy of Obama. And so I think it'll be a return to that. I think the two Well, there'll be three questions, right? The first one is what happens with the U.S. relationships with China? What happens with the U.S. relationships with Russia? And then more pointedly from our friend from Turkey who just responded, what happens with her president and U.S. relationships in the Middle East and in North Africa and in the dispute with Greece? So I think the two are large structural questions. I think the third one is an interesting question. I think Turkey's a valuable U.S. ally. I think it's a wonderful country, a great economy. It belongs with the West. So my preference would be that the current president take 2 steps closer this way than the other way.
Scott Klug, it was a great, interesting hour with us, and I'm really happy to see that, you know, loads of people joined. But we have just another one before we finished. It came like 10 seconds into our time. So that's the question from Tony from Croatia. Do you think the silent majority, as he says, as Trump usually talks about it, really exists? And are they pro-Trump?
I think there is a silent majority. I think the U.S. tends to get fixated on what's happening in either of the coasts. 4 years ago after Trump won, you know, the New York Times almost explained this like the British government sending out a diplomat to try to figure out what had happened in, you know, Botswana and Kenya. They couldn't understand what happened in Wisconsin and Michigan. So I do think there's a sort of a solid majority. I'm not sure the majority, though, is uniform. I think that it depends on issue by issue. I think the American electorate is much more stratified. So I don't think there's a, you know, one suburban woman model, one rural farmer model, one big city model. It's this big sort of stew that the United States has always been. Again, what I said earlier is I think Trump's strength is the economy. Biden's got the leg up on the virus. Biden has the leg up on healthcare. And I think that if the virus hadn't happened, I think Trump stood a very good chance of getting reelected. I think from the outside looking in as average Americans, they just see chaos. And the first presidential debate was hard to watch. I don't care who you were for. It was a pretty disappointing moment in American political history. So let's hope the next one on Thursday is great. And I want to thank all of you for your smart, bright, intelligent questions. Thanks to Ivana for hosting, and obviously thanks to my friends at the U.S. Embassy in Croatia and at the State Department in Washington for putting this together. And I appreciate the dialogue and the conversation, and I hope you learned something.
Thank you so much, Klug. We had another question. Do you think that there's a cultural war going on in the United States? But I think basically that you answered in a couple of those questions with these doubts about riots and questioning the result of the elections. If you have something to add to that.
There's been a cultural war going on in the United States since the 1960s. So I mean, I think a lot of folks look at this and say, it's 1968 all over again. When I was talking to my kids about this, they had like no idea of the scope of civil arrest in the U.S. in the 60s. And it sort of goes back and forth. And it's the sense of sort of New York and Hollywood trying to tell us how to, you know, run our lives here in the Midwest. And I'll stick with the people who are in my neighborhood. I think they have a much better sense of what makes America work than, you know, than folks who live in Hollywood or in Manhattan.
Thank you so much. As I see, we have hundreds of people basically watching us in different parts and the Europe and the world, which is showing us how big interest it is for the US elections, but not the less how interesting person we had today talking to us, Mr. Scott Klug. Once again, in my name, thank you. I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank everyone for joining us. And of course, US Embassy in Zagreb for hosting this event. So let's talk elections. Every month, US Embassy in Zagreb has similar lectures and events. And for the end, I want to pass the final words to Elisa Crane from the US Embassy. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elise Crane, the Assistant Public Affairs Officer at the U.S. Embassy here in Croatia. And I'm sorry we missed some of you on Facebook at the beginning, but I really want to thank Scott Klug for joining us and Ivana Dragicevic for moderating. It was really a fantastic event. And thank you to all of our friends joining us from across Croatia, from the American corners, and also across Europe and the world. As Ivana said, I think the interest really demonstrates that people would like to learn more about this. So I really thank you all, and stay tuned for future events that are to come. Thank you so much.